Right. Now that that's all been fixed, hi everyone, how are you doing? For those of you who don't know me, my name is Julien Hoez. I'm the editor of the French Dispatch, and I am a political expert working in Brussels on EU affairs, French affairs, geopolitics, security, and just about everything that I can get my hands on. And, well, the reason we're all here today is because Macron gave a big speech in the Sorbonne University in France, talking about the future of Europe, strategic autonomy, and just about everything under the sun. So, I'll probably throw this up onto YouTube at some point as well when I get the time, but otherwise, let's just get straight
Madame la
into it.
Présidente de
Let
l'Assemblée
me
nationale,
have a
Mesdames et Messieurs les
look-see at
ministres, Mesdames les premières, Monsieur le
going to
Commissaire,
be a wee bit loud. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to just drop it in underneath. But I mean, straight off the bat, the big thing about this whole speech is that, as you guys know, about 7 years ago, he gave his big Sorbonne speech back in September. And it was one of the big speeches he gave on EU affairs, EU policy, and kind of set him out as one of the leaders when it came to European thought and European politics, talking about everything from strategic autonomy to defense to security to just about anything you can think of. And really, this was exactly the same thing. So the big difference is possibly just the fact that he was a bit more pessimistic in general, but otherwise, all the big notes were there. The big federalist vibes, the big points on security, the big points on Europe's mortality, and the fact that we need to defend ourselves against everybody under the sun. Now, one of the big things I noticed about this speech before we even get into it is that he was honestly very. He seemed a bit exasperated. He seemed a bit annoyed about the fact that everybody was very much not really paying attention and had let things get so far. You heard this in a lot of the speeches, a lot of the contents of the speech. And honestly, he sounded a lot less hopeful than he did back in 2017 for obvious reasons. Since then, we've had COVID, we've had several central recessions, we've had several wars breakouts, and honestly, you're seeing in this a very different style of Macron. You're seeing a very almost cynical Macron in the way that he seems to be delivering a lot of what he's actually saying in this speech. And we saw this in one of the big statements he made, talking about how Europe today is mortal. It can die, and that Europe is not equipped to deal with the risks. That the rules have changed for the game, and that ultimately people aren't quite ready to deal with much of what is happening. And the EU isn't equipped as it stands to deal with the competition between all of the European competitors like the US, like China, like Russia, and that a lot of work needs to be done. And as you'll pick up throughout this, because I mean, I have about 4 pages of notes here, he's going to have to pick a big fight about this. He's going to have to really start focusing on how to get over everything. He's going to have to focus on getting these points not only through the member state level, but even then through the parliaments in the next mandate, deal with the commission and whoever the next commission president is going to be, and ultimately deal with a lot of the issues that come from working legislation at the European level ultimately. I mean, first off the bat, one of the big things he said straight up was that economically, the model that the EU has isn't sustainable. The way that the EU has functioned for the last few decades is just not functioning anymore. The EU is in a tumultuous position, and ultimately, a lot of it isn't necessarily down to the problems with what the EU has done, even if the EU has been slow. The problems are that the environment has destabilized to such an extent that really the EU has to find a way out. I mean, for example, he mentions during the speech that the US and China chose to break international rules on free trade. And that due to this and the fact that, for example, the US's IRA is undercutting all EU industries related to AI, tech, and everything. The fact that the EU-US Trade and Technology Council has basically failed and died a banal death. And on top of this, the fact that China is becoming more and more aggressive when it comes to just about everything it's doing, from electrical vehicles to telecommunications equipment to everything under the sun. In reality, the EU can't keep going as it's going. And he says this in the speech that, in his view, unless the EU reacts, it's not going to be able to create jobs, not going to be able to create any wealth. And with these failures, it's not going to actually be able to sustain the current economic and welfare models. And this is why he started bringing up his favorite position, point of the EU as a muscular global power, so Europe puissance. And he seems to be focusing this around 3 points. So defending the borders through economic, military means, and also defending the borders against illegal migration. Though one of the big weird things was that he didn't really touch on illegal migration as much, aside from calling for there to be more border controls and more logical positions to defend Europe's borders. However, understanding the need to actually have a strong financial framework for all of this, Macron ended up calling for what is effectively a doubling of the EU budget, which took quite a few people by surprise. And even from my side, I wasn't expecting him to go so far and saying that we need to literally double the already humongous EU budget, which I think is somewhere in the, let me not check, which is somewhere in the range of 1.082 billion for the last 7-year period. Now, how are you going to do this? A lot of people are going to ask, and you're going to see a lot of discussion about this in the next few months. But really, the easiest way is to do this, and this is a point that I agree with Macron, and he mentions this during his speech, is that in order to finance new own resources which would be required to actually do this, you would then need to start taxing financial transactions. So a big part of this is going to be taxing, transactions when it comes to investing, transactions when it comes to international trade, etc., etc. And also, he suggests putting a carbon duty on imports that fail to match the EU's environmental regulation, because there is always going to be an issue of these products leaking in or being allowed in through certain derogations or certain loopholes, and ultimately, this is something that's going to need to be done. Now, one of the really interesting things that he brings up is that he talks about the need to scrap rules on competition and trade in order to give the EU more flexibility to compete with the big guns. And this is going to be a very, very big fight. So, I mean, you're going to see Macron arguing some more with Vestager already from within the Council of Commissioners, and probably also the next Commission president. You're going to be seeing Macron fighting with the German leadership on this and the German politicians, because they are some of the biggest proponents of actually maintaining strong relationships with outside importers of our products and also investments in Europe. And on top of that, picking a fight with the US on competition. So we saw what happened with the Trump presidency, where there were tariffs put on some American products that were undercutting European products. And what this ended up leading to was mass tariffs on everything from cheese to wine to, I think, the few technological exports that we have in the EU. So there's really going to be a big fight on this. Now, on top of that, you're also going to have another issue when it comes to the industrial side of this, where, as part of this whole initiative to ensure European sovereignty, Macron ended up calling for a new prosperity pact, focusing on the need to put in place a system of European preferences in terms of all procurement, in terms of production, in terms of purchases, and all this kind of stuff. And a big part of this would be to protect strategic industries in the EU, such as defense and AI, such as the burgeoning semiconductors production capacities in the EU, and also focusing on a big, big, big financial investment production gambit on green, high tech, and nuclear investments. And I think what he called for was doubling these investments. Now, already, again, this is probably going to provoke some kind of conflict when it comes to the Germans, because the Germans are very much not in favor of nuclear energy right now, and it was a big issue between the German and the French Prime reps during the discussions on the energy mix of the EU energy market. And while this problem can be understood and it can be understandable, the real problem here isn't necessarily going to be in terms of actually finding an agreement on making investments into these products or into these sectors, or putting the investments on nuclear further up, or increasing the amount of financing that's being made available. I mean, the big issue is mostly going to be finding the space in the European budget to actually pay for these things. And one way that could be done is finding external investors, which is unlikely due to the fact that you're seeing Chinese companies and American companies being investigated and edged out as much as they can. But on top of that, you're going to need to, with these requests being made today, as far as I'm aware, the multi-annual financial framework's already been put together, so they're going to have to find ways of actually creating the credit lines to actually fund these kind of investments. Now, the European Investment Bank would potentially be a good route for this, but whether they're actually going to manage to actually agree on how to do this, and with the resistance for further indebtment of the European Union as an entity and not just working for the member states, there's going to be a lot of fighting over this, I can see. Now, another part of this whole sovereignty argument that was being made was borderline apocalyptic, very much based on concerns of the French state, and these took some very French positions in general. And even Macron made the jokes of, he's taking the French position, everybody knows the French position, and etc. etc. Clarify the camera, it's not a bit blurry. But ultimately, what ended up happening was Macron talked about the fact that Europe is too dependent on the US. And this is the big argument throughout the argument. So one of the big points he made was the issues when it came to the EU recovering from the financial crash of 2008 and the financial crisis that came after, and how this compared to the US reaction to recovering from this. Now, the obvious point to make on this argument is that, quite honestly, there are different means available to the US, there are different means available to the EU. And on top of that, they want the same levels of financial investments that could be made to save certain sectors, that could be used to put into certain economic systems and to actually finance the recovery from this financial crash. And as he has a habit of doing, and as he's done through Brexit, throughout the various crises that we've seen, as he did during the COVID crisis, as he did during the Russian crisis, he immediately went to the existential arguments. Europe is mortal. Europe can die. We're not equipped to deal with this, and the rules have changed. We need to get over this. And a big part of this was the fact that Europe has become far too dependent throughout history on various actors. So the big points that he made, in quoting him directly, Europe delegated its power in terms of energy to Russia, in terms of security to the Americans, and in terms of industrial capacity to China. And his big argument is that we just have to get over this and we have to stop doing this. That Europe has to become more independent when it comes to energy production, in the French vein through nuclear energy and through renewables, which is taking up gaining quite a lot of benefits right now through investments and through the actions of the member states. In terms of security, with the implementation of higher percentage of GDP investments into defense and security, which notably several member states are leading on in terms of this expenditure. So you've got Poland, who's almost at 5 or 6% in terms of GDP. France is hovering around 2 or so. Germany is coming up around 2 as well, and several other member states are quite higher. I think Lithuania, Latvia, and several other countries are around 3%. In terms of other critical powers, he's going to be leaning on the several pieces of legislation like the CHIPS Act, which is supposed to be onboarding more semiconductor production into Europe, the push to have more factories across Europe producing materials and military equipment for the European militaries. And on top of this, he made the arguments about the fact that Europe simply needs to get out of its rut. It simply needs to get over itself and it starts to actually start producing what it needs. He linked this in a bit with the points on immigration, where he talked about the sovereignty of defending European borders, making some allusions to the fact that states such as Russia are using, and Turkey as well, are using migrant flows to pressure the European Union, to pressure it into taking more favorable positions vis-a-vis their policies. And the fact that ultimately Europe needs to come out of this sort of, I think the phrase he used was culture war, to try to overcome all the problems and then try to become more independent and protected in what it's doing. Now, aside from this, touching a bit more on the Russian side of things, he made two streams of thoughts on this point. So firstly, he started talking about accession. And one big point on this was he made the point that Europe was doing the right decision, the right thing to bring on board the new member states that wanted to join the EU and to try to streamline these new processes and create new processes. So he talked a lot about the fact that it was a good thing that potential member states were making an effort to accept the acquis, to adopt the correct reforms, to make an effort to engage in rapprochement with the European Union and the member states in terms of joining the EU and becoming members. And he took a slightly more political point of view, which I think is probably slightly more linked to some of the political discourse that we're seeing in the European elections across the EU, where he made a very strong point on the fact that Ukraine's accession to the EU is a good thing. And throughout the speech, he was making a lot of statements regarding the fact that the EU was here to support its allies, that the EU was here to be a good partner, that the EU was here to actually engage in a geopolitical fashion, defend its interest, defend liberal democracy against authoritarianism that we're seeing in Russia, and to also make sure that the EU was, and that he praised the fact that the EU was taking its position here seriously while accepting that the EU had some severe weaknesses. And one of the big weaknesses here was that in his statement, he made it clear that currently, in terms of, and I'm quoting here, in terms of what he was talking about more generally, the collective incredible European defense, in his view, is clearly not here. And he made the point, first of all, that the Russian defeat in Ukraine is existential for the EU survival. That is necessary for Russia to be defeated in Ukraine, that is necessary for the authoritarian wing of the geopolitical arena to be put to the side, and that is essential for these people to see defeat and not victory. And it's for this reason that he was really, really dedicating a significant portion of his speech to this idea of collective and credible European defense. And one big part of this was onshoring a lot more defense equipment production, buying European, becoming more stringently independent when it came to key technological sectors such as telecoms, cyber, digital, and armaments. And also, and this is very much linked to what he said back in the 2017 speech, that the EU needs to refocus itself into strategic autonomy, that a lot has been done to date, but that more needs to be done. And this is where he talked about potentially the most interesting point of his speech, in my view, which was his idea for a European defense initiative. So ultimately, this seems to be building upon what he put together through the 2017 speech, what has been put together through the strategic compass from 2 years ago, what has been discussed at the international level when it came to more European engagement in NATO and further geopolitical organizations, and also just he used his more pessimistic points of his speech, the existential threat that the EU is facing, the potential collapse of the EU's position in the world, the fact that the EU can't take things for granted, he uses to put forward something that to me seems like it's an EU army in anything but name, but also not quite. So what he ended up discussing was he was talking about the fact that the EU needs a concrete European defense strategy that exists within NATO, and he avoided the comments, any statements about an EU army almost entirely. And on top of this, he also seems to have understood that the EU army idea is very problematic from several points of view because it always brings up some form of resistance from the Germans and the Polish, who are very concerned about losing American support, from the Americans, who are concerned that this means that NATO is going to be folded up underneath an EU army, and this is going to reduce their efficacy militarily in Europe. And on top of that, that they're going to end up losing some of the efficacy that's been made to date. Now, I believe this is why he's moved towards discussing this European Defence Initiative, where over the next few months, and probably beginning after the European elections in earnest, he's going to start discussing several initiatives as part of this, including a new strategy for full spectrum military abilities for the European Union. He's going to be discussing the creation of a European military academy to try to start unifying the education of military officers and soldiers across Europe to have some more interoperability, have some more common understanding, some more common training. And on top of this, he's also refocused his view on the points on the EU Rapid Reaction Force being built as part of the strategic compass, which is going to be launched, I believe, in 2025, as announced during the strategic compass discussions, and I believe this was touched on in an EU Council sometime last year by Charles Michel recently. And on top of this, he's also refocused around the discussion that makes the Americans very uncomfortable and will never not make the Americans very uncomfortable, which is the European preference on military purchasing. So I'm not going to bore you guys with the figures, but you all know about the fact that the EU, every single member state has its own procurement systems, it has its own weapon systems, it has its own production systems, it has its own importation systems, and we have a very fragmented military structure in Europe that leaves us, as Macron says it, trying to compare bullets and guns to see what fits where and what goes where. And this is something that makes it incredibly difficult when we're working as part of a multinational, global, international alliance that's supposed to be interoperable, that's supposed to be using interchangeable equipment, and that leaves us in a problematic position. We are weaker, we are less effective, we are less active, and we are effectively wasting money. And this is something that was mentioned several times during his previous speeches in Sorbonne since then, or over and over and over again. If we streamlined all of the European munitions and equipment production systems, if we onshored a lot more productions and manufactories for our assault rifles, our tanks, our fighter jets, etc., we would find ourselves with a lot more savings. We'd find ourselves a lot more effective, and we would find ourselves a lot more, let's say, efficacious in the way that we go about business. And these were, for the most part, the big points of his speech, but there was also quite a few things that you've probably noticed in the video playing in the background here. And if you listen to the speech, I believe France 24 had an English language version. France Diplomatie put one up on Twitter as well. There was something very interesting in the way that you see Macron speaking. You see that he seems borderline exasperated. You see that he seems almost aggravated about the fact that he's having to reiterate these points again 7 years down the line, because these were supposed to be the big victory notes of Macron's presidencies. Macron has put his reputation on the line as the pro-European politician. He's put his reputation on the line as the man who would make Europe stronger. He has put his reputation on the line as the president who would sort of overcome the fact that the French are seen as being a very particular brand of European politicians that are considered self-centered, etc., and that we've always had a reputation as people who have been very much not necessarily fully into NATO. We've always been anti-American, etc., just bringing out the stereotypes here, and to a very big extent, he's gone quite far in making this different. And you can see this in the way that the attitude towards the French position has changed in several years. So, for example, just looking at things such as European procurement and strategic autonomy, usually the reaction that we're getting is people saying that the Europeans or the French want strategic autonomy, they want to onshore production in Europe purely to make sure that French companies can make more money, that French companies can sell more fighter jets, more cannons, more vehicles, more guns, etc., because let's face it, in Europe, we're some of the biggest exporters of military equipment, and I think we're far behind the Russians and the Americans, but we are one of the biggest exporters, and we do a lot of business in the Middle East. And this is something that's very much a mentality that still exists, but is something that has very much been overcome to some extent. And this is something that I'm seeing even within the Brussels bubble here in Brussels, where less and less people are making this point, and more people have understood that the position of the French presidency is mostly that we want to have all European companies producing more equipment in Europe and making sure that we're also getting more, let's say, research and development projects through PESCO that can then be made and produced at a European level. I just seen a question from Derivki. Which countries support closer military initiatives, or rather, which ones do not? And this is a very interesting point and something that's very interesting to figure out because there's several rings to this question. It's a bit like the multi-speed Europe, where effectively you have a big portion of the countries or the member states, sorry, will find themselves sitting in several rings. So many agree that we need to have more independence in terms of how we procure weaponry. So I think there's a general understanding of this fact when you look at all the discussions that happen in the council. If you look at the minutes from council meetings and even from parliamentary meetings, the majority of the member states say that it's a good idea to have more weaponry. The problem is mostly that there is a fear of abandonment in many member states. So, for example, a lot of people they've become reliant on the way that NATO ensures security and that the European security is underpinned by America. You see in Europe that there are several initiatives to produce multi-nation battle groups. So there exists the Germano-Dutch tank battalion, which I believe operates as part of the German military. You're seeing several initiatives to cooperate in terms of military action between countries such as Spain and Portugal, for example. You have various military cooperation programs through EU NAVFOR, EU Atalanta, which combines naval action across all of the member states. And obviously through NATO, everybody's cooperating to some extent, and they're all taking part in multinational military initiatives. The problem, however, and this is ideally a question of sovereignty in general, is very much that people are scared of losing control of their militaries. They're scared of scaring off the Americans and losing their support if they have a more hawkish politician. And on top of this, for a little while, until they realize that the Russians quite honestly just don't care and they're going to invade whoever they want, whenever they want, they were also worried that there would be provocations towards certain other member states. So, for example, one big issue that we always saw was that when the French were proposing, for example, this rapid reaction task force at the European level as part of the strategic compass and as part of the French presidency's strategic initiative, what we ended up seeing was that there was some resistance from the Germans, the Poles, and also, I believe, the Austrians, because of one, there were concerns that it would try to replicate or replace certain parts of the NATO frameworks as an expensive waste of money and a duplication of efforts. That it would antagonize the Americans, who would see this as an attempt to get away from the NATO structures and NATO initiatives. And on top of that, they were also concerned of the fact that they would give away their control over certain military squads and teams who would form part of this 5,000 man strong unit or task force, apologies. But ultimately, they realized that as long as these task forces were still operating underneath the NATO banner, as long as they were operating more akin to the EU naval missions or the, let's say, the EU peacekeeping missions that we've seen across the board, that it was slightly more acceptable and it wasn't as concerning for them. But ultimately, I mean, this is something we're seeing replicated and that we're going to be hearing a lot for the next few weeks, or the next few months, sorry, as Macron tries to push forward this strategic initiative on this EU military defense initiative, because the fact that quite simply the member states need to come over this and they need to also get over this effectively. They need to understand that this is in their benefit. But we will probably see less resistance than we have in the past, because what we saw through the reaction to the Russian invasion and also Macron's suggestion that there would be French troops potentially stationed in Ukraine was that many member states were actually a lot more open to more aggressive European action than previously. So notably, we had Kaja Kallas, who came out in support of this. We had a significant portion of the Baltic states and their foreign and defense ministers, as well as presidencies and prime ministers, who were very pro action and who were also a lot more keen on acting than we thought, to be quite honest. But yeah, I mean, aside from that, I think those were the main points when it came to the Sorbonne speech. I mean, or whoever ended up missing this, or who ends up seeing this in the background on Twitch, or who has just joined, I will be probably sticking this onto probably Spotify and YouTube just to have it floating about. But if you guys have any further questions, feel free to find me on Twitter. You know where I am. And otherwise, just let me know and I can always respond to something in a future stream, because, hey, this is an experiment and we're seeing how this is going. But thanks for coming and hope you enjoyed yourselves.